The comment came during Christmas dinner at my parents' house, right after my sister Jessica had finished showing off the keys to her brand new Mercedes-Benz that she'd just picked up from the dealership that morning. A sleek black sedan with leather interior, and all the upgrades that probably cost more than I made in a year at my job as a middle school teacher. And everyone had been appropriately impressed, my father saying, "That's my successful daughter. Always moving up in the world," and my mother saying, "We're so proud of you, Jessica. You've worked so hard for everything you have." And my brother Tom saying, "Meanwhile, I'm still driving my 2015 Honda like a peasant," in that joking way that acknowledged the hierarchy in our family. Jessica at the top with her impressive career and her expensive possessions and her perfect life. Me at the bottom with my modest teacher salary and my 10-year-old Honda Civic that had a dent in the passenger door from when I'd backed into a pole 2 years ago. And Tom somewhere in the middle with his decent IT job that paid reasonably well, but didn't have the prestige of Jessica's position as a senior marketing director at a tech company downtown. Jessica had turned to me after accepting all the compliments about her new car and said with that particular smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to remind me of my place in the family. "Sarah, you're still driving that old Honda, right? The one with the dent. I saw it in the driveway when I pulled up, and I have to say it looks even worse than I remembered. Maybe it's time for an upgrade." And I'd said it runs fine. "I don't need anything fancy." And she'd laughed and said that's what broke people always say, "It runs fine," when what they mean is I can't afford anything better. And the table had gotten quiet for a moment before my mother said, "Jessica, that's not nice," but without any real conviction in her voice. And Jessica had shrugged and said, "I'm just being honest. Some of us are more financially successful than others. There's no shame in Sarah's situation. Not everyone can be a high earner." And I'd felt that familiar burn of humiliation mixed with anger that I'd been feeling at family gatherings for the past 5 years. Ever since Jessica had gotten her big promotion and decided that her financial success gave her the right to make comments about everyone else's life choices. My grandmother Alina had been sitting at the end of the table in her usual spot, mostly quiet during dinner, because at 87 she tended to conserve her energy for things that mattered. And I'd noticed her watching Jessica during this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disappointment and calculation, but she hadn't said anything. Had just gone back to eating her mashed potatoes, while Jessica continued talking about her new car and her recent bonus and her upcoming vacation to the Maldives that would cost more than my monthly rent. And I'd excused myself to help clear dishes because I couldn't sit at that table anymore listening to Jessica's casual cruelty disguised as family banter. And I'd stood in my mother's kitchen washing plates and fighting back tears, because this was supposed to be a happy family Christmas, and instead it was just another reminder that I'd somehow failed at life by choosing a career I loved instead of a career that paid 6 figures. My grandmother had followed me into the kitchen a few minutes later, moving slowly with her cane, and she'd come up beside me at the sink and said, "Sarah, dear, how are you really doing?" And I'd said, "I'm fine, Grandma, because what else do you say?" And she'd patted my arm and said, "You're a terrible liar. You always have been. I can see that Jessica's comments hurt you." And I'd said, "She's not wrong, though. I am broke compared to her. I do drive an old car with a dent in it. I can't afford vacations to the Maldives or designer clothes or any of the things she has." And my grandmother had said, "Money isn't everything, dear. You have something far more valuable than Jessica's Mercedes." And I'd said, "What's that?" And she'd smiled and said, "You have kindness. You have integrity. You have the respect of your students and their parents. You have a job that matters. And you have my love." And I'd hugged her and felt better for a moment. But as I'd driven home that night in my dented Honda, I'd still felt like the family disappointment, still felt like I'd somehow lost at life by choosing passion over profit. That was 6 months ago, and in those 6 months things had only gotten worse. Jessica had gotten another promotion, making her a vice president of something or other, had moved into a penthouse apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city skyline, had started dating a surgeon who drove a Porsche and took her to exclusive restaurants I'd only read about in magazines. And at every family gathering, she found new ways to highlight the gap between her life and mine. Commenting on my second-hand clothes, asking me if I'd ever consider getting a real job that paid better, suggesting I might be happier if I applied myself more, and tried to reach my potential instead of settling for mediocrity. And my parents, who I'd expected to defend me, would just make uncomfortable faces and change the subject. And I'd come to understand that in their eyes, Jessica's success reflected well on them, proved they'd raised a winner. While my modest life as a teacher somehow reflected poorly, suggested they'd failed with me, and I'd stopped going to as many family events because I couldn't handle being the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you choose the wrong path. My grandmother, Alina, had called me once a week during those 6 months, always checking in, always asking about my students and my life, never mentioning Jessica or making comparisons. And I'd treasured those calls because she was the only person in my family who seemed to value me for who I was rather than what I earned. And when she'd gotten sick in November with pneumonia that had required hospitalization, I'd visited her every day after work. Had sat beside her bed reading to her or just talking, and she'd held my hand and told me stories about her own life, about being young during World War II, about the choices she'd made and the things she'd valued. And she'd said more than once, "Sarah, you remind me of myself when I was your age. You have the same priorities. You understand that life isn't about accumulating wealth. It's about accumulating meaning." And I'd thought about that a lot, about meaning versus money, about whether I'd made the right choices. My grandmother had recovered from the pneumonia and been released from the hospital in early December, had seemed fine at Christmas dinner despite Jessica's performance. And when she died suddenly in her sleep 3 weeks later on a Tuesday night in mid-January, it had felt impossible, felt like someone so sharp and present couldn't just be gone. And I'd cried harder at her funeral than I'd cried about anything in years. Had stood at her graveside feeling like I'd lost the only person in my family who'd really seen me, really understood me, really believed I was enough exactly as I was. And Jessica had been at the funeral in an expensive black dress making comments about estate lawyers and inheritance, and who would get the house. And I'd wanted to scream at her that our grandmother had just died, and maybe we could mourn her as a person instead of calculating her net worth. But I'd stayed silent, because making a scene at a funeral wasn't who I was. The call from my grandmother's attorney came 2 weeks after the funeral, a man named Robert Harrison who said he'd been Alina's lawyer for 40 years and needed to schedule a family meeting to read the will. And he'd asked if the following Saturday at 2 p.m. worked for everyone in the family, my parents, my siblings, and me. And I'd said yes, even though I'd been planning to use that Saturday to grade essays, because apparently wills needed to be read with everyone present. And I'd assumed this would be a simple meeting where we'd learn that my grandmother had left her modest house to my parents and maybe a few $1,000s split between her grandchildren, because that's how these things usually went. And I hadn't thought much about it beyond the mild dread of having to sit in a room with Jessica, who would probably find a way to make the whole thing about her. Saturday arrived, and I drove to Robert Harrison's office in my dented Honda feeling tired because I'd stayed up too late grading papers. And I walked into the waiting room to find my parents already there along with Tom and Jessica, who'd arrived together. And Jessica was wearing what looked like a designer suit and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And when she saw me, she'd said, "Oh, Sarah, you came straight from work," in a tone that suggested I looked inappropriately dressed even though I was wearing a nice sweater and slacks. And I'd said, "No, I just dressed casually." And she'd said, "Well, I suppose not everyone feels the need to make a good impression at important legal meetings." And my mother had said, "Jessica, enough," but without any real force behind it. And we'd all sat there in uncomfortable silence until Robert Harrison's assistant called us into the conference room. Robert Harrison was probably in his 70s, distinguished looking with white hair and a kind face. And he'd greeted us all warmly and offered condolences about Alina, and said he'd represented her for decades, and had always found her to be one of the most remarkable people he'd ever known. And then he'd gotten down to business, pulling out a thick folder and saying, "Alina updated her will approximately 2 years ago. She came to me with very specific instructions about how she wanted her estate distributed, and she asked me to read this letter to you before we go through the legal documents." And he'd pulled out a handwritten letter in my grandmother's distinctive script, and I'd felt tears start to form, because seeing her handwriting made her feel present in a way nothing else had since she'd died. Robert began reading. "My dear family, if you're hearing this letter, then I've passed on, and I hope my death was peaceful and that you're not grieving too terribly. I've had a long and mostly happy life, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. But before I go, I want to explain some decisions I've made about my estate that might surprise you, and I want you to understand my reasoning even if you don't agree with it." And Robert paused to let that sink in, and I saw Jessica sit up straighter. Saw her exchange a look with my parents, and Robert continued. "I've spent the last 10 years watching my family carefully, watching how you treat each other, watching what you value, watching who you've become, and I've made my distribution decisions based not on fairness in the traditional sense, but on what I believe each of you needs and deserves based on your character and your choices." Robert kept reading. "To my daughter Margaret and her husband Robert, I leave my house at 2847 Riverside Drive, with the understanding that you will maintain it and that Sarah will always be welcome there." And my mother made a small sound of relief, because the house was worth probably $400,000 and had been in the family for 60 years, and my father nodded, looking satisfied, and Jessica smiled like this was expected. And I felt nothing because I'd never expected anything anyway, and Robert continued. "To my grandson Thomas, I leave $50,000 because he's always been kind, and I want him to have financial security." And Tom's eyes widened because $50,000 was more than he'd probably expected, and Jessica's smile got tighter, and I could see her doing math in her head about what might be left for her and for me. Robert continued reading my grandmother's letter. "To my granddaughter Jessica, I leave $10,000 and my wedding ring, not because I don't love her, but because she has plenty of money and doesn't need mine, and because I hope the small amount will make her think about what she values." And Jessica's face went from smug to shocked to angry in the space of about 3 seconds, and she said, "That's not possible. Grandma wouldn't. We were close. She wouldn't leave me only 10,000. And Robert said, "Please let me finish." And Jessica sat back in her chair looking like she'd been slapped, and I felt a strange satisfaction that I immediately felt guilty about, because finding joy in my sister's disappointment seemed petty even if she'd spent years being awful to me. Robert kept reading. "And to my granddaughter Sarah, I leave the remainder of my estate, which consists of investment accounts, savings accounts, stock portfolios, and property that I've accumulated over my lifetime, the total value of which is approximately $3,200,000. And the room went completely silent, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and Robert looked up from the letter and looked directly at me and said, "Sarah, your grandmother wanted you to have financial security and freedom to continue teaching without worrying about money. She was very specific about this. And I couldn't process what I was hearing because $3 million wasn't real money, wasn't money that people like me had, wasn't money that made any sense in the context of my grandmother's modest house and simple lifestyle." Jessica stood up so fast her chair fell backwards, and she said, "That's not legal. That can't be legal. You can't leave everything to one grandchild. That's not fair. I'm contesting this." And Robert said, "You're welcome to contest it, but the will is very clear, and your grandmother was of sound mind when she made these decisions. I have documentation from 2 separate physicians confirming her mental capacity." And Jessica said, $3 million. She had $3 million and lived in that tiny house and drove that old car and never said anything. And Robert said, "Your grandmother was a very private person who believed in living below her means. She invested wisely over many decades and accumulated significant wealth that she chose not to flaunt." And my mother said, "Why Sarah? Why would she leave everything to Sarah?" And her voice sounded hurt and confused, like she couldn't understand how the family disappointment, could be chosen over Jessica, the golden child. Robert pulled out another sheet of paper and said, "Eleanor anticipated you'd have questions, and she asked me to read this explanation." And he began reading another letter in my grandmother's handwriting. "I know you're confused about why I've left the bulk of my estate to Sarah, so let me explain my reasoning. I've watched all of my grandchildren grow up, and I've seen what they've become. Jessica is financially successful, and I'm proud of her professional accomplishments, but I've also watched her become cruel. Watched her use her success as a weapon against others. Watched her belittle Sarah at every opportunity for choosing a career that matters over a career that pays. watched her value money over kindness. And I don't want to reward that behavior with wealth she doesn't need. Tom is a good boy, but he's comfortable. He doesn't need millions. The 50,000 will help him, but won't change who he is. Sarah, on the other hand, has spent her entire adult life putting others first. Teaching children who desperately need good teachers, living modestly so she can stay in a career she loves, visiting me in the hospital every single day when I was sick even though she had papers to grade and lessons to plan. And she's done all of this while being made to feel like a failure by her own family. And I want her to know that she's not a failure. She's exactly who I hoped she'd be when she was born. And I want her to have the financial freedom to continue being kind and generous without the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck. Robert kept reading. I know some of you will think this is unfair, will think Sarah doesn't deserve this wealth because she didn't earn it the way Jessica earned her salary. But I'd argue that Sarah has earned it through character, through choosing meaning over money, through staying true to her values even when her family made her feel inadequate for those values. And I'd argue that giving money to someone who already has plenty while denying it to someone who's struggling would be the real injustice. And Robert paused and looked around the room and said, "There's more. Alina wanted me to read this next part carefully." And he continued, "Jessica, I love you despite your flaws, and I hope that receiving less than you expected will make you reevaluate your priorities, will make you think about who you've become and whether that's who you want to be. Money has made you mean. And I hope the absence of my money will make you kind again. And Sarah, my darling girl, please don't feel guilty about this inheritance. You deserve every penny of it. Use it to make your life easier. Maybe take that trip to Italy you've always talked about. Maybe buy a new car without a dent in it. Maybe just sleep better at night knowing you're financially secure. But most importantly, keep being exactly who you are. Keep teaching. Keep being kind. Keep valuing meaning over money. Because the world needs more people like you and fewer people like Jessica has become." The room erupted after Robert finished reading. Jessica was shouting about unfair distribution and legal challenges, and how Grandma had clearly been manipulated. My mother was crying, saying she didn't understand how her own mother could create such division in the family. My father was trying to calm everyone down while also looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between respect and resentment. And Tom was just sitting there looking stunned. And I sat there feeling like I was floating outside my body watching this scene unfold, unable to process that my grandmother had left me $3 million. Unable to understand how my life had just completely changed. Unable to feel anything except a strange numbness and a desperate wish that my grandmother was there, so I could ask her if this was really what she'd wanted. Robert Harrison pulled me aside after the meeting had devolved into chaos and my family had left still arguing, and he said, "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Alina thought about this decision for years. She didn't make it lightly. She consulted with me extensively about the legal implications and the family dynamics, and she was absolutely certain this was what she wanted. She told me more than once that leaving you this money was the most important thing she'd do with her estate. She wanted you to have freedom and security, and the knowledge that someone in your family valued you for who you were." And I started crying then, really crying, and Robert handed me tissues and said, "She also left you some personal items, letters she wrote to you over the years, photos, journals, things she wanted you to have that aren't in the legal documents. I'll have them sent to your address." And I thanked him and walked out to my dented Honda, feeling like I was in a completely different universe than the one I'd woken up in that morning. My phone started ringing before I'd even left the parking lot, Jessica calling, and I answered, and she immediately started screaming, "How dare you? How dare you manipulate Grandma like that? You must have poisoned her against me, must have convinced her I was some terrible person so she'd leave you everything. This is fraud. This is manipulation, and I'm going to fight this. I'm going to contest the will and prove you're not entitled to that money." And I said, "Jessica, I didn't know about any of this. I'm just as shocked as you are." And she said, "You expect me to believe that? You expect me to believe Grandma just decided to leave $3 million to the family failure, and you had nothing to do with it?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I expect you to believe because it's the truth. And maybe if you'd been less cruel to me over the years, Grandma wouldn't have felt the need to punish you this way." And she said, "Punish me. She punished me because I was successful, because I did well in life." because I made something of myself, unlike you who settled for being a mediocre teacher making poverty wages. And I hung up because I couldn't listen to her anymore. Couldn't handle her making this about her victimhood, when the reality was she'd spent years making me feel worthless, and now she was angry that someone had noticed. My parents called next, my mother first, saying, "Sarah, honey, I think there's been a mistake. Your grandmother wouldn't really leave you everything. Maybe there was confusion. Maybe Robert read it wrong. We should call him back and clarify." And I said, "Mom, there was no mistake. Grandma left me the money because she wanted to. And she left a letter explaining exactly why, and my mother said, 'But it's not fair to Jessica. Jessica worked so hard. Jessica deserves to be rewarded.' And I said, 'Jessica already has plenty of money. She doesn't need grandma's,' and my mother said, 'But she's your sister. You should share with her. You should split it evenly the way normal families would.' And I said, 'Grandma didn't want it split evenly. She wanted me to have it. And I'm going to honor her wishes.' And my mother said, 'Sarah, please, think about the family. Think about how this looks. People will think we raised you to be selfish.' And I said, 'People will think whatever they want to think. I'm not giving away money that Grandma specifically left to me just to make Jessica feel better about herself.' And my mother hung up, and I knew I'd just damaged my relationship with her. Knew she'd see this as me choosing money over family. But I also knew that my grandmother had chosen me for a reason, and I needed to honor that choice even if it cost me relationships with people who'd never really valued me anyway. The next few weeks were brutal. Jessica hired a lawyer to contest the will, claimed that Alina had been mentally incompetent when she'd made the changes, claimed that I'd exercised undue influence by visiting her in the hospital so frequently, claimed that the distribution was so unequal it suggested coercion. And Robert Harrison had to respond to each claim with documentation and testimony and evidence that my grandmother had been perfectly competent, and that I'd done nothing wrong except be kind to her. And the whole process made me feel guilty, even though I knew logically I hadn't done anything to manipulate the situation, had simply been a good granddaughter who'd loved her grandmother genuinely. And the fact that my family was interpreting that love as manipulation told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed relationships, as transactional rather than genuine. Tom called me about 3 weeks after the will reading and said, "Sarah, I just want you to know I'm not part of Jessica's contest. I think Grandma knew what she was doing. And I'm happy for you. You deserve this." And I started crying because he was the first person in my family to say something supportive. And he said, "I've watched Jessica treat you like garbage for years, and it's always bothered me, but I never said anything because confrontation isn't my thing. But I want you to know I saw it. And I think Grandma saw it too. And this inheritance isn't about money. It's about Grandma telling you that you matter, that your choices matter, that your kindness matters. And you should take that money and live your best life and not feel guilty about it for 1 second." The court case took 4 months, and during that time I continued teaching, continued living in my small apartment, continued driving my dented Honda because I didn't want to change anything until the legal situation was resolved. And my students' parents started treating me differently after word got out that I'd inherited money. Some of them became friendlier, like they wanted to be associated with wealth. Others became more distant, like they thought I'd look down on them now. And I hated all of it. Hated that money changed how people saw me. Hated that something that was supposed to be a blessing felt like a burden. And I thought a lot about what my grandmother had said about accumulating meaning versus accumulating wealth, and wondered if she'd known how complicated this gift would be. The judge ruled in my favor, found that Alina had been completely competent when she'd updated her will, found no evidence of undue influence, found that her distribution choices, while unequal, were within her legal rights as the owner of the assets. And Jessica's contest was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file another challenge. And Jessica sent me a text that just said, "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family." And I wanted to respond that the family had been destroying me for years with their constant comparisons, and their casual cruelty, and their assumption that success meant money rather than meaning. But instead, I just blocked her number because I was done explaining myself to people who'd never tried to understand me. I paid off my student loans first, the loans I'd been carrying since college that had hung over me for over a decade. and watching that balance go to zero felt surreal. Felt like a weight lifting that I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. And then I bought a new car. Not a Mercedes like Jessica's, but a practical, reliable sedan that didn't have a dent in the door. And when I drove it for the first time, I cried thinking about my grandmother saying I should buy a car without a dent in it. Thinking about how she'd known exactly what small indignities I'd been living with and had wanted to give me the freedom to fix them. I started a scholarship fund for students at my school, kids from low-income families who wanted to go to college but didn't have the resources, and I endowed it with $200,000 because my grandmother had talked about the importance of education, and I wanted to honor her by helping kids who valued learning over earning. And when the school announced the Alina Johnson Memorial Scholarship at an assembly and explained that it would send one student to college every year in perpetuity, the whole auditorium stood and applauded. And I sat there crying thinking about how my grandmother's money was going to change lives for generations, was going to do exactly what she'd wanted it to do, which was create meaning. I took the trip to Italy that my grandmother had mentioned in her letter, spent 2 weeks wandering through Rome and Florence and Venice, staying in nice hotels and eating in good restaurants, and not worrying about the cost for the first time in my life. And I sent postcards to Tom and to a few friends who'd supported me through the legal battle, and I felt my grandmother's presence the whole trip, felt like she was with me encouraging me to enjoy this freedom she'd given me. And I bought a painting in a small gallery in Florence, a landscape of Tuscan hills that cost more than I would have spent in my old life, but felt right in my new one. And I hung it in my living room where I could see it every day and remember that I was allowed to have nice things, that wanting beauty didn't make me shallow, that my grandmother had wanted me to enjoy life, not just survive it. I kept teaching, which surprised everyone except Tom, who said he'd never thought I'd quit, and my principal asked me why I was still there when I didn't need the money anymore. And I said, because I love teaching, because these kids need good teachers, because my job was never about the money, it was about the meaning, and having money doesn't change what makes my life meaningful. And she'd hugged me and said I was the kind of teacher she wished she could clone. And I'd thought about my grandmother saying I reminded her of herself, saying I understood that life was about accumulating meaning, and I'd understood then that the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about validation, was about my grandmother telling me that my values were right even when everyone around me said they were wrong. Jessica and I didn't speak for a year after the court case ended, and then she sent me an email saying she wanted to meet for coffee, and I debated whether to go, but curiosity won out, and we'd met at a neutral location, a coffee shop neither of us frequented, and she'd looked different, less polished somehow, less aggressive, and she'd said, I owe you an apology, a real one, not the kind where I apologize but justify my behavior. An actual apology where I acknowledge I was cruel to you for years and you didn't deserve it. And I'd said, what changed? And she'd said, I got fired. My company downsized and I was let go. And suddenly all the money and status I'd built my identity around was gone. And I realized I'd been defining myself by what I had instead of who I was. And I didn't like who I was. I'd become someone mean. Someone who used success as a weapon. Someone Grandma was right to be disappointed in. Jessica continued, I've been in therapy since the will reading, trying to understand why I was so threatened by your kindness, why I felt the need to make you feel small. And my therapist helped me see that your choices challenged my choices. Your decision to prioritize meaning over money made my decision to prioritize money over meaning seem shallow. And instead of examining my own life, I attacked yours. And that was wrong, that was cruel, and I'm sorry. And I'd said, I appreciate the apology, because I did, even though I wasn't sure if it changed anything between us. And she'd said, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it yet. I'm just asking for the chance to rebuild some kind of relationship where I'm not constantly trying to make you feel less than, where I can actually be a sister instead of a competitor. And I'd said, I'd like that, because despite everything, she was still my sister, and I wanted to believe people could change. My parents came around eventually. Took them almost 2 years, but they did come around. And my mother called me one day and said, Sarah, I need to apologize. I've been thinking a lot about how we treated you growing up, how we always compared you to Jessica, how we made you feel like your career choice was a disappointment. And I realize now that we were wrong, that we valued the wrong things, that we should have been proud of you for following your passion, and for being kind, and for making a difference in kids' lives. And I'm sorry we made you feel like you weren't enough. And I'd cried because I'd wanted to hear those words for so long, had wanted my parents to see me and value me. And hearing it finally, even years late, mattered more than I'd expected it to. 3 years after my grandmother died and left me her fortune, I was living a different life. Not dramatically different in terms of daily routine because I was still teaching, still living in my same apartment because I liked my neighborhood, still eating lunch with the same teacher friends in the school cafeteria, but different in terms of security and freedom, and knowing that I had choices, knowing that if something happened, I wouldn't be devastated, knowing that I could help people in ways I'd never been able to before, and I'd started doing more of that, quietly helping students with field trip costs or supplies, funding classroom projects, supporting teacher initiatives, and not telling anyone it was me because I didn't want recognition, just wanted to make things better in ways my grandmother would have approved of. Jessica and I had rebuilt a relationship of sorts, not as close as we'd been as kids, but closer than we'd been in years. And she'd started her own business after getting fired, something smaller and more meaningful than her corporate job had been, consulting with nonprofits on marketing strategies. And she'd told me, "I'm making a fraction of what I used to make, but I'm actually happy, actually feel like my work matters. And I understand now what you were trying to tell me all along about purpose versus paycheck." And I'd said, "Better late than never," and she'd laughed and said, "Grandma would be proud of you, and probably disappointed in how long it took me to get here, but at least I got here eventually." Tom and I had always been close, but we'd gotten closer after the inheritance situation. He'd never asked me for money or treated me differently, had just been consistently supportive and kind. And when he'd gotten married, I'd paid for his honeymoon as a gift, sent him and his new wife to Hawaii for 2 weeks. And he'd cried and said, "Sarah, this is too much," and I'd said, "It's not enough. You were the only one who stood by me when everyone else was attacking me. You deserve more than a honeymoon." And his wife had said, "Your grandmother was right about you. You're exactly the person she thought you were." I'd started dating someone I met through a friend, a man named David who was a nurse at a free clinic and who had no idea about my inheritance when we first met. And we'd gone on several dates before I'd told him about the money. And he'd said, "Does it change who you are?" And I'd said no. And he'd said, "Then it doesn't matter to me. I'm dating you, not your bank account." And we'd been together for over a year now, and he'd never asked me for anything. Had always insisted on paying for dates or alternating who paid. Had supported my continued teaching even though I didn't financially need to work. And I'd realized that my grandmother's inheritance had given me not just financial security, but the ability to see who people really were, to see who valued me for me versus who valued me for what I had. 5 years after my grandmother died, I commissioned a bench in her name at the park where she used to walk every morning, had a plaque installed that said Eleanor Johnson, who taught us that kindness is the only wealth that matters. And at the dedication ceremony, my whole family came, my parents and Tom and Jessica and their spouses, and we'd stood together looking at this bench that would be there long after we were all gone, and Jessica had said, she'd like this. She'd like being remembered for kindness rather than money. And I'd said, she'd like that you've learned the difference, and Jessica had nodded and said, I'm still learning, but I'm trying. I'd used some of the inheritance to buy my grandmother's house from my parents, the house where she'd lived for 60 years, and I'd converted it into a community center offering free tutoring and after-school programs for kids from the neighborhood. And I'd named it the Eleanor Johnson Learning Center. And on the opening day, I'd stood in what used to be her living room surrounded by students and teachers and parents, and felt her presence so strongly, it was like she was standing beside me. And I'd said in my speech, my grandmother taught me that wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives touched, and people helped and kindness given freely. And this center is my attempt to multiply her wealth, to spread her legacy of caring and supporting and believing in people who need someone to believe in them. And the room had erupted in applause, and I'd cried because I knew I was doing exactly what she'd hoped I'd do with her money, was using it to create meaning not just for myself, but for my entire community. The scholarship fund I'd started had sent 15 students to college by the 5th anniversary of my inheritance. 15 kids who wouldn't have been able to afford higher education without that support. And I'd stayed in touch with most of them, had watched them graduate and start careers, and become exactly the kind of people my grandmother would have been proud to know. And one of them had written me a letter saying, "You gave me a chance when no one else believed in me. You invested in me when I had nothing to offer in return except the promise that I'd work hard. And I want you to know that I'm paying it forward. I'm starting my own scholarship for kids from my neighborhood, because you taught me that wealth isn't something to hoard, it's something to share." And I'd cried reading that letter because it was proof that my grandmother's values were spreading, were multiplying, were touching lives she'd never know about but would have been thrilled to impact. I thought about that Christmas dinner often, the one where Jessica had made fun of my dented Honda, the one where I'd felt like the family failure, the one where my grandmother had watched silently taking everything in. And I understood now that she'd already made her decision by then, had already updated her will, had already chosen to bet on kindness over success. And her decision had changed my life not just financially, but emotionally, had given me validation I desperately needed. Had told me that someone saw my worth even when I'd started to doubt it myself. And that gift, the gift of being seen and valued, was worth more than the money, even though the money had certainly made life easier. Jessica and I had lunch once a month now, a tradition we'd started after she'd apologized. And at one of those lunches about 6 years after Grandma's death, Jessica had said, "Do you ever regret it? Do you ever wish Grandma had split everything evenly so we wouldn't have gone through all the drama?" And I'd said, "No, because the uneven split forced all of us to confront who we'd become, forced you to reevaluate your values, forced Mom and Dad to examine how they'd treated me, forced me to stand up for myself and honor Grandma's wishes even when it was hard. And if everything had been even, we'd have just continued in our dysfunctional patterns without ever addressing them." And Jessica had nodded and said, "You're probably right. I'd probably still be chasing money and status and making you feel bad about yourself. And I'd probably be miserable even though I looked successful. And now I'm actually happy even though I have less." My parents had started treating me differently after the inheritance, not because of the money, but because the inheritance had forced them to reevaluate their assumptions about success. And my father had said to me about 4 years after Grandma died, "I've been thinking about how we raised you girls, how we praised Jessica for every promotion and raise but barely acknowledged your teaching awards. And I realize now that we taught you that money was more important than meaning, and that was wrong. And I'm sorry I made you feel like your career was less valuable than Jessica's." And I'd hugged him and said, "Better late than never, Dad." And he'd said, "Your grandmother knew. She knew we were making mistakes and she tried to tell us, but we didn't listen. And then she used her will to make us listen, and it worked. We're listening now." The inheritance had given me freedom to make choices I couldn't have made before. I'd taken a sabbatical year to write a book about teaching methods for underserved communities, something I'd always wanted to do, but couldn't afford because sabbaticals weren't paid. And the book had been published and had become required reading in several teaching programs. And I donated all the royalties to educational nonprofits because I didn't need the money and the organizations did. And someone had written a review saying, "Sarah Johnson writes with the wisdom of someone who understands that education isn't about test scores. It's about human connection. And her work reflects a deep commitment to the idea that every child deserves not just instruction but care." And I'd thought about my grandmother reading that review and being proud, about her knowing that her money had enabled me to share my ideas with a wider audience, about her understanding that wealth was a tool for creating more meaning, not just more comfort. 7 years after my grandmother left me her fortune, I was 39 years old and living a life that felt authentic and meaningful and free in ways I'd never imagined possible. I was still teaching because I loved it, still living modestly because that felt right, still driving a nice but not extravagant car because I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And I was using the money to fund projects and programs and opportunities that aligned with my grandmother's values. And every time I wrote a check or started a new initiative or helped a student or supported a teacher, I felt like I was honoring her, like I was proving that she'd made the right choice, like I was demonstrating that betting on kindness over success had been exactly the right call. Jessica had come to me about 5 years after the inheritance and said, "I need to tell you something. I'm not asking for money. I just want you to know. And I'd said, what is it? And she'd said, I'm broke, really broke. I had some business setbacks and I'm living paycheck to paycheck. And it's hard. It's really hard. And for the first time, I understand what your life was like all those years when I was making fun of your Honda and your second-hand clothes. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't understand how hard it is to live without financial security. And I'd said, do you need help? And she'd said, no, I mean, yes, I could use help, but I'm not asking. I don't deserve your help after how I treated you. And I'd said, everyone deserves help when they need it. That's what Grandma taught me. Compassion isn't something you earn, it's something you give. And I'd helped her, had given her enough to get stable. And she'd cried and said, why are you being kind to me after everything I did? And I'd said, because that's who Grandma raised me to be, and because you're my sister and you're trying to be better, and that's worth supporting. 8 years after my grandmother died, I got a letter from a woman named Patricia who said she'd been my grandmother's best friend for over 50 years. And Patricia wrote, I want you to know that Alina talked about you constantly in the last years of her life. She was so proud of you, so proud of your teaching and your kindness and your commitment to your values. And she was so disappointed in how your family treated you. And she told me more than once that leaving you her fortune was the most important thing she could do, that she wanted to show you that someone valued you for who you were, not what you earned. And I watched her plan this for years, watched her be so deliberate about every decision. And I want you to know she never doubted her choice, never second-guessed leaving you the bulk of her estate. She was absolutely certain you were the right person to carry on her legacy of generosity and compassion. Patricia's letter continued. Alina asked me to give you this letter after she'd been gone for several years. She wanted you to have time to adjust to the inheritance, to see how it changed your life or didn't change your life. And then she wanted me to tell you this. Sarah, my darling girl, if you're reading this letter from Patricia, then several years have passed since I died. And I hope you've used the money well. I hope you've helped people and created meaning and stayed true to yourself. And I hope my family has come around and realized that you were right all along to choose passion over profit, to choose meaning over money, to choose kindness over success. And most of all, I hope you know that you were always exactly enough. You were always exactly who you should have been. And leaving you my fortune was my way of telling you that you won. You won the game of life that everyone else thought you were losing, because you built a life of meaning while everyone else was building lives of money. And meaning lasts longer than money. Meaning matters more than money. And meaning is what I'm leaving you along with the cash. I sat in my living room reading Patricia's letter and my grandmother's words, and I cried harder than I'd cried since her funeral because even years after her death, she was still teaching me, still validating me, still making sure I knew I mattered. And I understood then that the inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about love, had been about my grandmother using the only tool she had left to tell me that she saw me and valued me and wanted me to have the security and freedom to keep being exactly who I was. And that message, that gift of being truly seen, was worth more than $3 million, was worth more than any amount of money, was the real inheritance she'd left me. 9 years after my grandmother left me her fortune, I established the Alina Johnson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting teachers in underserved communities with grants for classroom supplies, professional development, and financial assistance. And I endowed it with $1 million because teaching had been my passion, and my grandmother had supported that passion, and I wanted to multiply that support for other teachers who were choosing meaning over money the way I had. And at the foundation launch event, I gave a speech about my grandmother and her values and her belief that kindness was the only wealth that mattered. And I said, my grandmother left me money, but what she really left me was permission. Permission to keep choosing passion over profit. Permission to keep valuing meaning over money. Permission to keep being kind even when the world says that kindness is weakness. And this foundation is my way of extending that permission to other teachers who are making the same choice I made, who are choosing to invest in children's futures instead of their own bank accounts. And I hope every grant we give carries the same message my grandmother gave me, which is, you are enough, your choice matters, your work has value beyond what you're paid. 10 years after my grandmother died, and changed my life completely, I stood in her old house that was now a thriving community center, and looked around at the students being tutored, and the families being supported, and the programs being offered. And I thought about that Christmas dinner where Jessica had mocked my dented Honda, where I'd felt like the family failure, where my grandmother had watched and calculated and made decisions that would change all our lives. And I was grateful for every hard moment that had led to this. Grateful for Jessica's cruelty that had shown my grandmother who needed protecting. Grateful for my family's blindness that had made my grandmother's sight so valuable. Grateful for my own struggles that had taught me compassion. And most of all, grateful for my grandmother who'd seen me when no one else did, who'd valued me when my family didn't, who'd bet on kindness over success and proved that she'd been right. And I whispered to her spirit that was everywhere in this building she'd bought, and I'd converted. Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the money, but more than that, thank you for the message. Thank you for telling me I was enough. Thank you for proving that meaning matters more than money. And I promise I'm using your gift exactly the way you hoped I would. I'm creating meaning. I'm spreading kindness. I'm being exactly who you taught me to be. And that's the real inheritance. Not the dollars, but the values. Not the wealth, but the wisdom. And I'm so grateful you left me both.